to be able to introduce Dr. Keisha-Khan Perry, who's speaking. She's doing our closing kind of keynote presentation on land. I don't have any title.
I didn't really understand. Was it?
I didn't know what
Program on the program.
Okay.
I hope.
Is it the same?
I wrote it on the slide and then.
Okay, so her title is Black Land Ownership and Loss in the Americas, a Transnational Perspective. And Keisha-Khan Perry is an acclaimed scholar, Brazilian in the area of Brazilian studies. Her work focuses on issues of race and gender in Brazil and land, urban displacement, especially in the city of Salvador, Bahia. And she's also a good friend and colleague and someone who, after we have phone calls, I usually, or toward the end of the phone call, I say, you just always make me laugh, which I did the other day. So she's a great person, and I'm glad she could come down and be with us today. She was also one of our speakers last year for our summer workshop, and we decided to invite her back because of the relevance of her research. So Keisha-Khan Perry received her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin in anthropology in 2005. She is Associate Professor of Africana Studies and specializes in the critical study of race, gender, and politics in the Americas, with a particular focus on Black women's activism, urban geography, and questions of citizenship, feminist theories, intellectual history, and disciplinary formations, and the interrelationship between scholarship, pedagogy, and political engagement. She has conducted extensive research in Mexico, Jamaica, Belize, Brazil, Argentina, and the United States. And her book was published in the last few years. It's called Black Women Against the Land Grab. It's an ethnographic study of Black women's activism in Brazilian cities, in the city of Salvador specifically. And she's also engaged in a study which documents and analyzes the historical paradox of citizenship and Black land ownership and loss in Brazil, Jamaica, and the United States. She's also working on a multilingual and transnational exploration of Black women's political work in Latin America by critically examining how Black women mobilize political movements across borders and how they understand themselves as agents in creating a diasporic community. So please join me in welcoming Keisha-Khan Perry as she comes and speaks to us tonight.
Thank you so much, Dr. Caldwell, for the very lovely introduction as well as the invitation to participate in this summer seminar, as well as to Emily and Willie and everyone else who has made my visit so comfortable and wonderful. It's quite a joy to visit UNC for the first time, so it's great. And this is a side note, I should say that when I started graduate school in 1999, sounds like so long ago, it was Kia Lily Caldwell dissertation that I found in the Benson Library that actually made it possible for me to feel that I could write a dissertation focused entirely on Black women. So great influence. And our advisor said that it was actually Kia who first taught him about feminist theory, and then I kind of followed up after she graduated, so that was great. I just wanted to kind of begin by kind of outlining just a few key points from my research over the past 15 years. We do a little bit of reading, but I hope that at some point, just to kind of stay on task all the time, I'm hoping that at the end, whatever questions of clarification that you have, I had to cut kind of several thousand words so from this. So I hope that it will be a kind of a vibrant discussion. And in light of what's happened in the past few weeks, I'm hoping that you'll see the kind of connections that I'm trying to make. And what I won't talk extensively about in this particular paper, but it's a book project that I hope to kind of come out of this project that will start soon. It's called Evictions and Convictions, the gendered racial logic of Black dispossession in New York City. And that's actually what I presented last week at a conference on contested cities. But I'm hoping that you'll see how I'm trying to make these connections between kind of gender, race, land, gentrification, housing, etc. So there are a few key points from my research over the past 15 years that I want to highlight, and that you will see as kind of centered in my work. And is that I understand Black dispossession, or the loss of land, territorial rights, access to adequate housing, gentrification, access to clean water, as a form of the loss of land and territory, the loss of these resources as a form of anti-Black violence. So if we think about Flint, Michigan, for example, those ideas will come to mind. Also, that police violence works in tandem with the destruction of Black urban communities, and that racial terror and mass incarceration also work in tandem with mass evictions and gentrification in modern global cities. That Black urban spaces are racialized, gendered terrains of domination, to use Stuart Hall's term, in which Black women's politics are deeply connected to resistance against geographic domination as practice enforced removal and dispossession. Black dispossession is at the center of anti-Black activism throughout the Americas, from North America to the Southern Cone. So you may have discussed earlier on in terms of the significance of Latin America for the African diaspora, more than 100 million people of African descent. And that one of the things that I've discussed in my own work, as well as Professor Caldwell, is that one of the main issues that Black people are talking about is not just kind of how they self-identify, which is oftentimes the discussion among academics, but questions like housing and land, to health resources, etc. So Black women are talking about these key material issues. Feminist theory in the first place, and that's one of the things I'm trying to do, is return to the key material concerns for Black women. That said, Black women are also key political protagonists, mobilizing at the grassroots and neighborhood associations and other kinds of NGOs. And Black women should be considered kind of a key category of social science inquiry in the Americas, who have been exploding these conversations on racial violence in North America and beyond, and South America as well. Tonight, I'm hoping to focus on 3 examples from my own research in Brazil, Jamaica, and the United States to underscore this relationship between Black dispossession, the violence of anti-Blackness, and collective gendered anti-racism activism that highlight the political work of 3 particular women. So I'll get started on that. So in chapter 1 of my first book, Black Women Against the Land Grab, The Fight for Racial Justice in Brazil, I begin with the narration of the agony of Dona Telma, who stood in front of a bulldozer as it was about to demolish her home in the Palestina, which translates to mean Palestine, neighborhood of Salvador da Bahia in 2003. The conflicted bulldozer driver, known as Senora Milton, even more than being afraid of the fully armed military police, was profoundly shaken by the pressure of the family and the neighbors mobilized to fight the demolition, and he refused to carry out the job. Part of my argument in the chapter that echoes throughout the book is that scholars of social movements need to pay attention to Black women's political participation and leadership, as Dona Telma and her struggle for land rights are rarely mentioned in the story. I have argued that it is necessary to refocus on the courageous landowner, Dona Telma, and the numerous other poor Black families in peripheral neighborhoods facing similar land disputes. Black women are at the heart of the struggle for urban land rights in Salvador and the citywide housing and land rights movement. Yet very little was heard, and little is still known about Dona Telma and her family's land claims. The story of Dona Telma should also be considered as one kind of ethnographic backstory for the popular street protests in Brazil in June 2013 that drove more than 1 million people to the streets in major cities from Recife to Rio de Janeiro. Over the past decade, I've focused on my research on how, as a result of the forced demolition of urban neighborhoods and displacement of residents, urban spaces are terrains of constant struggle for Blacks, women, and poor people in Brazil. Lacking the legal and financial means of countering urban redevelopment, residents of poor Black neighborhoods have mounted a significant grassroots resistance against the threat of loss of their land and homes. When all else fails, community organizations led by Black women continue to develop strategies for resisting demolition when the bulldozers arrive. But there has been little public empathy for community activists like Dona Telma, and the Brazilian media has had little interest in documenting the violent displacement of Black communities that these communities face. That includes the ongoing mobilizations against the mass displacements and increased militarized policing in preparation for the World Cup and the Olympic Games. In a recent news update, Senora Milton, the bulldozer driver, was asked if he would do the same thing again today, stepped down from the bulldozer, and he replied, it was a day that changed everything for me, and I would do exactly the same again. I have a home, I have a family, and what right do I have to come and pass a tractor over another person's home, leaving everyone with no place to sleep, without shelter? I have done this kind of work, I have never been asked to do it. I have never done this kind of work, and I've never been asked to do it again. The bulldozer driver's actions should be understood within the context of poor and Black people's solidarity with an ongoing urban movement against land evictions. He was also a poor Black worker who lived in one of Salvador's peripheral neighborhoods. It happened to Donatelma's house and land in Palestina that were targeted. It happened that it was her house and land that were targeted, but it could just as well have been his family's house and land under siege elsewhere. What is driving the next phase of my scholarship on the struggle for land rights in Brazil is my preoccupation with shifting away from a certain kind of political exceptionalism that undergirds our understanding of present-day popular protests. There is a history of these conflicts, of Blacks owning and losing lands, of small and large mobilizations to regain individual and collective land rights. Some of the earliest documents in Bahia, which is the state where Salvador is located, reveal how Black families such as Donatelma's came to own land in the city in the first place. On the day of the scheduled demolition, Donatelma showed the police officers legal documents certifying that her land had passed from the original owner to her grandmother, whose descendants had always lived and worked on the land since the colonial period. After Donatelma's grandmother died, the land was bequeathed to her children and grandchildren. Before Donatelma built her house on the property, the land was undeveloped and other families occupied adjacent lots where they built their houses and raised their children. Black economic historian and now city councilman Silvio Passos Acuna has documented in his research how Blacks today, and this is an important point I want to underline, Blacks today own significantly less land than they did during the slavery period, and that Black women, especially leaders of tejeros or Afro-Brazilian candomblé religious sites of worship, have owned and lost significant parcels of land in cities. In his analysis of the Bahian Recôncavo, or the coastal territory of the Bay of All Saints in Bahia, where sugar plantation dominated the slave economy, at the end of the 19th century, in the transitional period from slavery to abolition, Cunha shows how the gradual process of emancipation over the course of the late 19th century led to a rupture in the social racial order and formation of cities such as Salvador. In some instances, plantation owners gave land to their former slaves in hopes that they would continue to work on the land and not disrupt agricultural production. Cunha's economic and historical perspective leads our story beyond Donatelma's personal struggles taking place on the periphery of Salvador to trace her family's ownership claims over the course of the last century. Her story exemplifies the violent land disputes taking place today in response to the coordinated efforts of unscrupulous land grabbers, developers, military police, and demolition squads. Donatelma's claim of seemingly benevolent transfer of land to Black women after years of unpaid service as domestic workers or nannies is not unusual in the historical legal records, which also points to the complexity of social as well as biological ties. For example, these Black women, landowners, were oftentimes the children of wealthy white landowners, and in many instances were indeed their former slaves who were encouraged to stay on the land to continue domestic and farm work. And in essence, some of them in the documentation you find were actually the children of the landowners themselves. So this example of Donatelma also unearths a historical engagement by Brazilian Blacks with kinship, property rights, and the law, as well as the advancement of a language of ownership and citizenship belonging, and the rejection of the pervasive use of the pejorative term of illegality and squatting that is oftentimes used to describe these Brazilian cities, And at this point, I want to turn to the United States to look at our own relationship to land ownership and loss for our own kind of material understanding of citizenship rights in this country. I would like to take us back to July 2010. Shirley Sherrod was serving as the state of Georgia's first black director of rural development for the U.S. Department of Agriculture when the Obama administration demanded her resignation. A couple of months earlier, she had given a speech to the Coffee County NAACP in which she told the story of her breakthrough experience with an elderly white farmer. In twisting what Sherrod thought was a powerful message of choosing not to hate to an audience who in their majority had lived through Jim Crow, an edited version of the speech represented her as admitting to practicing racial discrimination in the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Assistance Fund. She was placed on administrative leave and later forced to resign. Her former colleagues at the Federation wrote a statement to the Secretary of Agriculture. We find it ironic that in the 100 years of USDA's history of discrimination, not a single white person has been dismissed for discrimination. However, a black woman who is doing her job well is falsely accused of discrimination in an altered video, and you decide that she can no longer do a credible and non-discriminatory job of defending USDA rural development programs and must resign. In her recent memoir, The Courage to Hope, How I Stand Up to the Politics of Fear, Sherrod describes how the episode of political drama was hardly representative of how she had lived until then. In 2010, she was middle-aged and had been doing what she called she had been an unglamorous worker bee who liked to keep her head down and do my job. By the end of July, she was offered an official apology, but she was not offered her old job back. Shirley Sherrod and her cause of black land rights had become disposable. Sherrod's untimely departure reveals a peculiar history that hardly attracts the same kind of media circus as an accusation of reverse racism and public shaming and dismissal. Many still lack knowledge of her political trajectory, including her direct involvement in exposing racist practices in the distribution of USDA loans to black and women farmers, which led to the massive loss of black-owned land and in making black land ownership a crucial civil rights issue in recent decades. The work that she had long been doing in silence and without much public recognition involved the development of community land trusts throughout the United States. When black farmer John W. Boyd Jr., president and founder of the National Black Farmers Association, drove his tractor from Virginia to Capitol Hill in September 2010 and through the city of Washington each morning, there was little public outrage about the historic racial discrimination suit involving black farmers. Boyd had previously ridden his mule in front of federal buildings in Virginia and New York as a direct reference to the failed promise of 40 acres and a mule for freed African Americans. The Federation of Southern Cooperatives Assistance Fund provides a historical outline of black land loss that is crucial for my mapping of what that loss looks like over space and time. In 1903, W.B. Du Bois launched a serious critique against the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, commonly referred to as the Freedmen's Bureau. The United States federal agency established in 1865 during the Reconstruction era to assist freedmen with employment, education, healthcare, and other everyday needs. Du Bois wrote, "In the work of establishing the Negroes as peasant proprietors, the Bureau was from the first handicapped and at last absolutely checked. Something was done and larger things were planned. Abandoned lands were leased so as long as they remained in the hands of the Bureau, and a total revenue of nearly $500,000 derived from black tenants. Some other lands to which the nation had gained title were sold on easy terms, and public lands were opened for settlement to the very few freedmen who had tools and capital. But the vision of 40 acres and a mule, the righteous and reasonable ambition to become a landowner, which the nation had all but categorically promised the freedmen, was destined in most cases to bitter disappointment. Du Bois understood that the well-intentioned work of the Bureau created a system that returned freedmen to plantation life as laborers with few rights and few prospects of socioeconomic uplift. The government's failure to fulfill its promise of 40 acres and a mule that would guarantee black land ownership represented a significant obstacle to avoid dependency on the federal government. For Du Bois, land ownership signified black self-reliance, and the Bureau's abandonment of the granting of land rights under Reconstruction as a result of violent white opposition to blacks having any rights at all meant for U.S. history, Du Bois would claim, a missed opportunity for achieving democracy. According to the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, at the peak of black land ownership in 1910, and the decline begins at that time, blacks collectively owned 15 million acres in the United States, and 218,000 black farmers were part or full owners of their land. By 1973, they owned only 6 million acres, and by 1992, 2.8 million acres, and there were only 18,000 black farmers. I should add that by the time folks like Shirley Sherrod was doing their political work, there's a steep increase in the amount of black farmers. Blacks, by 2007, there was actually about 41,000 black farmers, and by 2012, as a result of this hard work, there were 44,000 black farmers. Shirley Sherrod had been an integral political force in this long civil rights movement as a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and later as the founder of the Southwest Georgia Project, and guaranteeing land ownership and fighting against forced land loss in the black struggle for freedom and democracy has always been part of her quiet, unglamorous work. She and her husband, Charles Sherrod, famous for his leadership in SNCC, founded a self-sustaining community farm called New Communities in Lee County, Georgia, borrowing from the Jewish kibbutz system. She was also instrumental in forging the relationship between manufacturers and black planters and processors that formed the Southern Alternatives Agricultural Cooperative and the Southern Rural Black Women's Initiative. That's also, I think, in terms of pecan farming, some of the main suppliers for big corporations like Ben & Jerry's. Focusing on the struggles of black farmers in the United States encourages us to look at and attempt to narrow the rural-urban divide to connect housing rights struggles in cities to the historical and spatial genealogy of black land loss nationwide. And I should add that one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on rural blacks is that in the United States, there is this sense that blackness is associated with cities and urban life, but that there's a significant portion of the black population actually live in rural areas and are fighting to kind of keep the lands that they're living on. So as examples in Brazil and Jamaica also show, mass demolition of poor neighborhoods, mass displacement as a result of foreclosures and gentrification are also land rights issues that reveal the complexity of property ownership and loss, as well as cultural and spatialized citizenship in cities. For example, it is impossible to separate the violent terrorism that has plagued black farmers or the burning down of all black towns from present-day violent state policing and mass incarceration in cities accompanied by black urban renewal. Removal. Black acquisition of land increased under the New Deal, then declined over the course of the last century as the necessary government grant programs favored white and wealthier farmers, and many black rural residents fled the South to escape rampant racial violence and lynching. How women experience this violence and incarceration, oftentimes becoming heads of household who make decisions of property ownership, is key. For example, Sherrod's own father was shot and killed in a dispute with a white neighbor who wanted to steal his cattle. Her then pregnant mother took control of the farm as well as fought to avenge his death. Blacks who came to populate cities such as Chicago, New York, and even Las Vegas would succumb to the effects of social and economic abandonment, poor living conditions, and increased criminalization. Black critical geographers have argued that black people came to these spaces and looking for freedom in search of a new and better way of life, but came to be understood and deemed disposable. Displacement, or being forced to move, exemplifies this link between anti-racism activism and disposability, or the disposability of black spaces and black lives, which includes black rural landowners and urban residents, as well as black women like Shirley Sherrod, who fought against black dispossession and for black land rights. As in the era of Jim Crow, anti-black dehumanization and brutality necessitated the enforcement of a logic of state-sanctioned racial segregation of space. In these instances, land loss for black farmers and increased policing, incarceration, and killings of blacks in cities amidst urban redevelopment and gentrification practices expose local struggles over space and ownership. And for those of you who are interested, I would encourage you to read George Lipsett's book on racial kind of spatial imaginaries. And he has one chapter on kind of black spatial imaginary and another one on white spatial imaginary. And he really does a good job of outlining precisely the preoccupation with kind of location and space and the segregation of space and tied to kind of racist ideas and practices. So in these instances, I should say that it's impossible for us to kind of, in terms of looking in cities, if we were to look back to examples like in July 2014, Roseanne Miller, a 27-year-old pregnant black woman, was put in a chokehold by police for the supposed crime of illegal grilling on a public sidewalk in Brooklyn. And a few days prior, Eric Garner was choked to death after refusing to be frisked on a sidewalk located in the gentrified neighborhood of Tompkinsville Park on Staten Island, where he was accused of selling loose cigarettes. In urban spaces undergoing rapid renovations, the increase in nuisance complaints from these new pioneers, residents, and business people have led to an increase in violent police confrontations. In the struggle over spatial belonging, which is ownership, use, and control of space, black refusal to move and to know their rightful place can be deadly. So connecting, this is important for me to connect this pattern of black dispossession and state violence in cities as well as in rural areas in Brazil and the United States. And I want to kind of make a transition to see how it relates to what's going on in Jamaica, which is my home country. And I apologize in advance, when I talk about Jamaica, my accent changed. I don't have any control over that. It's going to sound funny, but it's just who I am. So Rastafari has been ordered to evict our birthplace by January 30th, 2014. The Occupy Pinnacle movement, led by Donisha Prendergast, the late Bob Marley's granddaughter, and well-known activist Queen Odesh, is taking place right now as I speak. The tombstone of Leonard Percival Howard, located on the stretch of mountainous land of more than 500 acres in the parish of St. Catherine, Jamaica, has already been demolished. Howell bought the land with the wages he earned as a seaman to establish what would become the village of Pinnacle in 1938, almost 25 years before Jamaica's independence from England, and founded a place for free-thinking man and woman to live, learn, and grow within the context of their indigenous African heritage. Pinnacle attracted thousands of black Jamaicans who created a self-sustaining community, providing their own food, school, arts on the island under colonial rule. It would become the birthplace of Rastafari, and agriculture, including marijuana, was the most important source of income for the village. And I should pause and say that I actually was reading up on black farmers in Florida who are constantly fighting a law that's prohibiting them from growing marijuana and partaking in what is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States. They were practicing, and the big threat for communities like Pinnacle in Jamaica was that they had found a way to profit from marijuana, and that's part of the danger in terms of creating a new economic system. They were practicing freedom on their own terms. Their aim was to generate wealth to collectively buy land and repatriate it to the African continent. The acquisition of Pinnacle was a philosophical and religious project grounded in Pan-Africanism, but it was profoundly political and economic in practice. On May 23rd, 1954, the colonial powers burnt down Pinnacle as part of a negotiation with the British, and residents were forced to hide in caves on the property and move to the trenches of the local city. Since then, many material artifacts of Rastafari history have been destroyed, including ancient burial grounds, and the lands have been subdivided into new homes constructed. Including Jamaica in this analysis of black land loss represents a crucial aspect of my ethnohistorical exploration and my theoretical and methodological attempts to link Latin American, Caribbean, and U.S. social and political context in the in the African diaspora. The Occupy Pinnacle movement reveals precisely how gendered racism, intertwined with unequal relations of social and economic power, operates in predominantly black countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, such as Jamaica and Brazil. Rastafari represent not only a religious group in Jamaica, but also a racial group in a society dominated historically by a brown and white minority. And if racism against dark-skinned blacks existed throughout the centuries, Rastafari are further marginalized for what Howell termed their free-thinking beliefs based on an indigenous African heritage. The racism and marginalization they have experienced on the island results from a general disdain for blackness and African consciousness, the political foundation of Rastafari, as well as what scholars such as Shamara Al-Hassan Wiley have argued is a misinterpretation of women's social and political power. In fact, the destruction of Pinnacle and its physical and psychic erasure from popular memory, including from Rastafari collective historical accounts, cannot be disassociated from the anti-colonial movements and post-independence efforts to modernize and hence Europeanize the population, which had racial as well as gendered implications. Pinnacle, as a new way of thinking, a new culture, a new self-sustaining economic practice as Rastafari, as what activists have now called a material manifestation of a philosophical tradition and vision of collective black freedom, like Quilombos in Brazil, was a threat to Jamaica's sovereignty. And this is really important because Rastafari, not only, they believed not just in terms of maintain a different kind of philosophy, but that they actually lived separately from and created a new society, the same way that Quilombos were created, and they still kind of live outside of the law in some regards. For example, they don't get married under the law, they don't believe in the state controlling and dictating those kinds of relationships, right? And they don't believe in formal kind of employment and so forth. They don't believe in particular kind of legalized forms in terms of working at the state. So today, the land signifies for the politically elite opportunity for development aimed at modernization and progress. Even as some of the racial hierarchies have been broken down and dark-skinned blacks have become national leaders, a particular kind of anti-black class racism still permeates on the island. Political scientist at the University of West Indies, Maziki Them, has argued that those black men and women who occupy these zones of non-being in the French-Fanonian sense throughout the Americas are dispensable for the state, the elites, and for poor people themselves, and justify the violence. But amidst these demolitions and land evictions in Jamaica, Them has asked, why aren't there more uprisings or mass protests around these issues? Rastafari scholar activist Kirk Scarlett, also known as iNation, suggests that police and military violence present during these evictions provide a concrete example of how the Jamaican state has become a monster that leads to a dependent black population to crouch in agony and pain when the violence takes place. Political parties have created individual rather than collective empowerment necessary to mobilize and fight the state-sanctioned violence of housing and land loss. Scarlett also alludes to what performance theorists Hannah Ford Smith and Kristen Smith refer to as the normalized repetition of violence, specifically the death of black children and state-sanctioned demolition, that creates a politics of fear, as Shirley Sherrod and Ida B. Wells also cite in relationship to the United States, on the part of black women. In Jamaican cities, poor black women would rather escape or find escape routes and move their families to the rural areas than fight state-sanctioned gangsterism that produce ecologies of fear. And that the same goes for the burning down and destruction of all black towns in the United States, Rosewood, Seneca Village, and Seneca Village, New York, also now known as Central Park, for example. A collective active acceptance of partial citizenship also suppresses mass resistance against state and state-supported actions. This is really important because in the case of Jamaica, and to understand how Pinnacle became so popular among poor people, is that they would rather move to the rural areas and establish a new way of being than to stay in the city and deal with all of the political violence that takes place, right? So, for example, there's a saying in Jamaica that goes, you can never starve to death in the rural area in a way that you can starve to death in a city, right? Because there's a way to kind of build self-sustaining communities. That's also how the running joke in Jamaica about Usain Bolt as well is that all of these kids grew up on an organic diet versus in the city. Right? I think that's why they call them the yellow yam crew. Right? So, however, when so the women-led Occupy Pinnacle movement shows us that as Rastafari in Jamaica, although comprising the most marginalized of the black population, already have a history of cultural and political mobilization that threatened a particular kind of gendered racial emancipatory project in Jamaica in the past and continues to threaten a certain kind of modernization project today. In conclusion, I hope that we'll open it up for discussion, and I'd love to answer whatever question you may have. In my research, I've begun to outline an historical ethnography of African descendant communities and their struggle for citizenship belonging, particularly tied to land struggles throughout the Americas. Each geographic context illustrates that there are several historical antecedents to the contemporary land rights struggle and gendered anti-racism mobilization in general. These ethnographic insights illuminate how blacks in Brazil, Jamaica, and the United States have come to understand the importance of land over time, being propertied versus propertyless, and engage in the theoretical debate about the relationship between land, indigeneity, freedom, sovereignty, and national belonging. Carol Boyce Davies, literary scholar, her most recent book, Caribbean Spaces, Escapes from Twilight Zone, is deeply influential in this comparative analysis. And my own work is guided by her idea of recognizing what she calls the deliberate continuities in the Americas for imagining black liberation. Davies calls for an expansive notion of the underground railroad or escape routes, which in Latin America and the Caribbean could also include the Maroon societies, the Quilombos in Brazil, the Cimarrones and Palenques in other parts of Central and South America. We see this in the mobilization of the term Afrodescendentes or Afrodescendientes and the preparatory meetings of the UN conferences against racism. Davies refers to sets of passages that pursue liberation in different directions and movements of freedom not only toward the north, but also from the north to the south, therefore also from the Caribbean to the United States, and in reverse from the United States to the Caribbean and South America. And this is part of my attempt to not speak about Brazil in kind of exceptional terms, to say Brazil is so distinct from the United States, but to look at how these ideas and practices are circulating over time, and as well as what we can learn from looking to Brazil and what Brazilians have already been learning from looking to the United States, but looking at how these ideas are moving, not just north-south, but also south-north and across. A hemispheric look at Brazil, Jamaica, and the United States pushes Davies' idea of escape routes further, including the migratory patterns of political ideals, such as the material claims of citizenship, including property ownership. For example, Afro-Brazilian scholar and activist Abdias Nascimento is best known for coining the discourse of quilombismo or marunage that emphasize the need to Africanize our knowledge and worldview across borders and within nations, as well as to acquire land and to construct alternate black communities. Canadian geographer, and I should back up and say that the construction of Quilombos were not just about escaping, it was about doing something else other than the system that people knew, right? So I think this is really important, and you see that in terms of Pinnacle, you see this in terms of the new communities that folks like Shirley Sherrod set up, is that it wasn't just about living separately, it was about another way of thinking and being, right? Canadian geographer Catherine McKittrick suggests that today, black diaspora subjects continue to demand and celebrate land ownership as a politics of black refusal of a passive relationship with space. And Dion Brand talks about the importance, even though as problematic as ownership or property ownership may be, especially when we start to think about terms like indigeneity and what it means for the displacement of indigenous folks, that African descendant people, because of being forced to move, are preoccupied with landing and some kind of footing and grounding themselves, even on land that actually produces nothing that's profitable, right? So this is especially important where blackness is disavowed or perceived as a problem and best kept out of sight, oftentimes through the use of violence, incarceration, and murder. Specifically, my research reveals the historical dimension of how blacks, with black women as leaders, have struggled to belong spatially, to occupy space, to be visible in the landscape, but as owners of land. And in Dion Brand, again, to kind of have some kind of landing, to kind of some kind of footing, and to belong in some kind of concrete, material way, right? And I would like to leave you with a few kind of key facts related to this work. In Colombia, there are more than 4 million displaced Afro-Brazilians, not Afro-Brazilians, Afro-Colombians. Sorry. Saying about Brazil, I'm heading to Brazil instead. Brazilians is on my mind. And there is a women-led movement as well for territorial rights taking place, and I'm sure that folks like Arturo Escobar spoke about this. There are currently 2.5 million people incarcerated in the United States, with the largest prison population in the world. And you might know this, but I think within the context of land rights, this is really important, because what's happening with a lot of rural lands is that the rural landscape has become kind of polluted in some ways by prisons. And that prison development is one of the most kind of rapid, and the prison industry is one of the rapid kind of increase in industries taking over rural landscapes, providing free labor on these lands. So I think it's really important. And what that means for women who then have to kind of move between cities and places like upstate New York, I think is really important in terms of that constant movement between the cities. So this, and then on top of it, a 2.5 million population that is, and even more than that, that have come through the system at some point, that then start to operate outside of what is the polity of the United States. What does it mean to have, millions of people who have been incarcerated in some point have no participation in how decisions are made about their lives in this country, right? So it's a physical displacement in terms of displacement, that you kind of get disposed out of society, but even when you return, you have little significance. So I think that's really important. You become disposable permanently. And according to the $1 Million Block Project, while Chicago faced a fiscal crisis in 2017 with over $8 billion in unpaid bills, and many, including parents, were fighting in terms of in the public schools, fighting school closures, Illinois committed $1.4 billion. That amounts to $1 million per block to the Department of Corrections with prisoners coming primarily from 4 neighborhoods in the city, right? And part of my work in New York has been looking at the zip codes that are gentrifying zip codes that are generating the prison population. So even when I look at and I say that women don't amount for the same amount, women are not equal to men that are being incarcerated, the majority of the women's prison, that's the rising number of people who are incarcerated today, black women, that the majority of women, black women and brown women in New York City are coming from the same zip codes. They're coming from the same city blocks, right? And when these city blocks are the ones that are also being gentrified and changing, and when they come out of prison, they don't move back to those blocks, right? So I think this is really important. And then also in 2011, and this is where I think, as an anthropologist, it becomes really important in terms of working with statistics, and why ethnography is really important for really understanding how violence takes place. That in 2011, New Yorkers were stopped by the police 685,724 times, right? And in 2012, 532,911 times. So even those numbers might seem, just as numbers, but what does it mean for that many people, almost 700,000 people, to have been harassed by the police in some way or another? And one of the things that I've looked at is that in terms of understanding black dispossession in cities, is that really there's a war over space and control of space. And one of the ways to make cities more hospitable is to first convince people that they're safe. And one of the ways to convince people that they're safe is to increase policing. Right, so for new pioneers coming in, for the pioneers, you need more policing. Another part of this is really important, is that in 2015 in New York City, there were approximately 18 million nuisance calls, mostly noise complaints, right? And that compares to the 335,000 in 2005. So 10 years later, you're talking about from 335,000 to 18 million calls that were made to 311, which is the lower emergency, obviously, number. The calls were mostly in Manhattan, mostly in Harlem and Inwood, and we know what's happening with Harlem and Inwood, and in places like Central Park where people actually don't live. So I think that this is really important to kind of start to think about one, that there's in terms of a kind of actual kind of war taking place against poor and black and brown folks, but that there's always a spatial kind of dimension in terms of people kind of making claims to space and what it means that these rapidly kind of transforming rural and urban landscape and what's taking place, that policing and the violence of policing is always intricately related. And to understand that with 18 million nuisance calls and the amount of times that police officers are called out to these spaces, how that increases the possibility of conflicts with the police officer in terms of those confrontations. So I'll end there and open it up for questions.
I'll start. I'm thinking about a lot of things. I'm thinking about the sessions that we had earlier, and thank you. That was for me. You've made a lot of connections that I need to think about. I'm wondering if you could say just a little bit more about communication in communities. You were talking about north-south, south-north, and south-south. I'm just wondering if you can just give us a little bit of texture of how these experiences are being talked about, maybe by activists.
Mm-hmm. There's several ways I can answer that. I should say that I became really preoccupied with this by teaching in an Africana, because I teach in the Africana Studies Department, and I've been teaching about Brazil, and there is this tendency to want to say, oh gosh, it's just so horrible what's happening in Brazil, right? When you start to kind of tell the numbers about, for example, that you're more likely to be shot and killed by the police than to contract Zika, which everyone is, terrified of Zika. But people are more concerned about other things, right? So that people would make it seem as though it was so horrible. And I would say, well, the healthcare system isn't also fair to African descendant peoples here either, right? So I think there was once I kind of started to be preoccupied with kind of moving away from a certain kind of racial exceptionalism, that somehow things were either worse in Brazil or somehow they were better off in terms of the cordiality and so forth, right? So I think that this is what I was kind of working against. To look to see how there was a circulation of ideas, some racist, and in terms of practices. So to look at a city like New York that had been proven to be successful in terms of effective policing. For example, Giuliani and folks had been praised for effective policing and zero tolerance, translated and implemented in cities like Brazil, became Tolerância Zero, which meant that increased militarization of cities like Rio, that stop and frisk, undocumented in those cities, was actually everyday practice to the point where Afro-Brazilians actually carry ID as a requirement, right, in a way that we don't even carry IDs in the United States. So particular practices, including waterboarding, had been perfected on Afro-Brazilian bodies in order to then be perfected in the war in Afghanistan, for example, and Iraq. So part of what I became preoccupied with is to look at how these things were circulating. That the Rio SWAT team actually trained the Austin City SWAT teams, right? So there's not, so I think for me, and that there are military officials that are attending the School of the Americas, are participating in the School of the Americas, that are hearing graduation speeches from heads of state from, let's say, Chile, for example, or Nicaragua, or wherever else, and they're sitting alongside North American officials. So there's a circulation of ideas that have been taking place, right? For me to find out that there was waterboarding taking place in women's prisons in the United States at the turn of the 19th century, right? In the same way they were also used in military dictatorship in Brazil. So these are not to say that these are North American things taking place and these are happening in South America, that there's a circulation of ideas and practices in the same way that ideas were circulated in the colonial period around punishment and discipline, punishment and ways of maintaining order on plantations, etc. So I think that's one part of it. The other part of it is how people understand, how activists understand their relationship, their anti-racism activism, right? You see that in the UN conference against racism and xenophobia. There is a sense that that people are mobilizing globally as part of the African diaspora, facing similar issues from South Africa, around the African continent, and across the Americas, that you should be in solidarity and working in solidarity with each other, because we're fighting against similar forms of oppression. Right, so I think concretely that's how folks understand it. I think there is a kind of, even among African Americans, this desire that somehow things must be different someplace else. The same thing with Jamaicans, would say, in Jamaica, there's no racism in Jamaica. That somehow it must just U.S. is just worse, right? That we want to hope that in Jamaica something else happened. But but I think what I found out recently was that the Chilean government actually funded the opposition to Maurice Bishop. So there are all these kind of connections and ways of thinking about why, how do you prevent Jamaica from becoming another Cuba? How do you prevent Grenada from, then that they're also kind of working in terms of how you kind of get rid of these enemies within, that are the black activists, the indigenous activists, the leftist activists, that are asking for kind of a redistribution of resources within these nations, right? So I can keep going on and looking at the connections, but I think partly there's a kind of political and pedagogical kind of preoccupation would say that we're not so distinct, we're not so different, and our hands are not clean by any means necessary. Yeah. Yes.
I'm really interested in this idea of like Quilombos and maroon communities, and can you say a little bit more? You mentioned what Shirley Sherrod's work looks like in rural communities. Can you say a little bit more about that? And then are there any examples of this sort of like different type of living and being happening in urban centers in America?
I'm not as familiar with concrete examples, although the MOVE, I think more recently in terms of the MOVE organization that we're familiar with, Mumia and Abu Jamal, that part of the violence against that community, that wasn't a kind of an urban attempt to create something else within that the police itself squashed, right? They killed, kind of burned down the block, and then also led to the permanent incarceration of folks like Mumia. Right, so I think that those were kind of attempts at kind of alternative urban communities in some ways. I think that partly I should say that the caveat for new communities is that folks like Charles Sherrod and other folks who traveled to Israel looked kind of uncritically to a different kind of model through the kibbutz system, right? So they were looking for some other way of doing things, but without the complex history between Israel and Palestine, to then do something similar in the United States. And I think that's the trouble in terms of theoretically about how to frame this preoccupation with kind of land and land ownership in the United States without looking at how that relates to settler colonialism. So I think that's the real kind of struggle. But I think for the new communities, they actually had a full functioning schools, in terms of ran a farm, that kind of sold to the surrounding communities. But the idea was that it was, the children all lived on the land, that people took care of each other's children and took turns and so forth. That you would create something outside of the system that as we know it in the United States. I think that was an attempt. In terms of what I'm familiar with now and looking at cities like Newark and even I'm more familiar with Newark, New Jersey. Is even how the Nation of Islam has kind of provided new kind of ways of imagining kind of community in these spaces, right? In terms of food, as well as Hebrew Israelites. I think that's another example. Kind of new ways of building community, new ways of preparing food, urban farms, and so forth. So I think those are the examples that I can think of. But that's a fascinating question and probably requires a lot more research. But I think in some ways it fits under the kind of the Quilombo model of kind of doing something else other than what we're familiar with, that the current system doesn't work. And it's always along the line of, in essence, kind of a commune an egalitarian system. That's partly what Pinnacle was trying to do, that no one, you wouldn't have to, you'd be able to make your own food, kind of self-reliant, and, you could circulate the resources and everyone kind of live on equal terms. The interesting thing about Pinnacle was that they were really preoccupied with profit as well to actually repatriate, which is the big problem for Jamaican elites.
So what you're saying is making a utopia is hard.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk and all the different connections between the different regions and displacement from land, displacement of bodies, the ones about the prison system as well. And one thing I just was thinking about when you said zero tolerance was then the connection with schools as well.
Oh, absolutely,
And so
absolutely.
Earlier, I think I mentioned we visited the Jackson Center, this local community center, and they put up some statistics about suspensions and expulsions of Black students here
Absolutely,
in Chapel
absolutely.
Hill, Carver School. So, and that's, of course, a very big issue, and the high levels of displacement of Black students from school. So I was just wondering, if you could comment on the connections with Brazil and Jamaica with that as well.
So it's interesting because so I started off, trying to figure out what my next project was going to be, and I decided to do this kind of comparative project. And in doing the work on the United States, I decided I wanted to focus on New York. Through doing that work, in terms of thinking about how gentrification takes place, is that schools became a significant part of it, but also always tie in kind of the change in kind of urban landscape with, and then understand that policing and militarized policing is always a part of that process. Successful gentrification requires heavy policing. There's no way around it. Just like how even college campuses have now, they're operating with military grade weapons, right? Which I'm trying to figure out why. But that said, that the schools, so one is the street level policing that we're most familiar with. Another part of the work that I've kind of shifted into now is looking at how landlords and banks are just doing their own kind of everyday policing, that you don't require, so trying to talk about how the police are just the legitimizing kind of forces, right? They're doing the work that's already being done. Right, so then, for example, that police and the order of police is actually a recent phenomenon. Obviously, regular people did policing before they became organized. So partly what you find is that schools were doing and continue to do a tremendous amount of policing work on the everyday, right? So especially in the new kind of charter school system, you find that those are the spaces where Black girls are actually being tracked and being targeted for disciplinary mechanism. To the point where one of my graduate students gave an example of this, the student who, they're so their bodies are even so policed that in terms of asking for permission to go to the bathroom and those kind of things become a real problem. So I think that you can't talk about even gentrification without talking about the role, the displacement of public schools, the displacement of and the increase in the explosion of charter schools, with the promise that charter schools are also, because of the development associated with charter schools. So it's not just, it's not just the Teach for America teachers, and actually I should say that Brown is one of the #1 places where they recruit teachers for Teach for America. But it's not just the temporary teachers, but it's also the idea that development, they're building new, beautiful, bright, shiny buildings that kind of improve neighborhoods, right? At the same time that they're displacing permanent teachers as well as traditional students in some regards, right? So you can't think about housing without thinking about the role of schools as part of that process.
I think we have one last comment back here.
I just wanted to ask, I know time is short, but I was curious, whatever happened with Ms. Sherrod? I know that after Barack Obama apparently called her and they had like a 7-minute conversation and he apologized and offered a job back, she sued Breitbart, I guess the person who edited the tapes, and I was curious, like, did whatever happened to her after that?
That's a good question. I think she went back to continuing to work with the Southwest Georgia Project. But I don't know if I have much more in terms of great detail and beyond kind of her writing the book and doing a lot of speaking tours and continuing a lot of the work around advocacy for black farmers outside of kind of the official work of the federal government. And it's interesting because she actually didn't even want to work with the Department of Agriculture. She was encouraged and pushed to do that work and kind of focused, but then afterwards kind of focusing on more of her writing and her scholarship and going back to doing the work that she was already doing. But I can't give you a ton of details about what happened afterwards beyond kind of the speaking tours and so forth in terms of her own kind of new political work. But I think part of the reason why I use that example is really to look at the significance of kind of land rights struggles with civil rights struggles in a way that becomes kind of ignored in kind of the broader conversations around what's significant in these instances. The fact that, for example, the lawsuits by black farmers are still kind of left unsettled, and that organizations like the Southern Cooperatives Fund is still significant in terms of fighting and documenting the loss of land, but also fighting to kind of encourage more rural blacks to own land and run their own farms.
Well, we want to thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for a wonderful presentation.
I know the blood done signed my name. I know the blood done signed my name. Well, my name's been written down in the Lamb's Book of the Lord. I know the blood, oh, the blood done signed my name. I know the blood done signed my name. I know the blood that signed my name. You know my name is written down in the Lamb's Book of the Lord. I know the blood that signed my name. I know the blood that signed my name. I know the blood that signed my name. You know my name's been written down in the Lamb's Book of the Lord. The blood done signed my name.
I know the blood done signed my name. Blood done signed my name. You know my name is written down